Each of the report viewer controls has the ability to work in two different modes. The first is server mode. In this mode, the report viewer control uses a server report that's hosted on a reporting services server that has the .rdl extension. The server report is managed and rendered by SQL Server Reporting Services. The report is executed remotely on the reporting services server and displayed within the control. In other words, just like most of the examples throughout this reporting services course. But then the other mode is local mode. In this mode, the report viewer control uses a local report, which has an RDLC extension. The local report is rendered locally, either on the web server for web applications or the user's desktop for Windows Forms applications. As I mentioned, most of the examples that I use throughout this entire course are geared towards managing and running server reports. But the technique of using a local report is important as well, and I'll be talking about that in another part of the course. So first, let's start talking about using the report viewer control with server reports. So the web version of the report viewer control is a server-side control that you can use on your ASP.NET Web Forms application. And remember that you can use a web form within an MVC application as well. To use the control with the reporting services server report, there are a few general steps that you take. First, you just drag the report viewer control from the Data tab of the Visual Studio Toolbox and drop it onto an ASPX page within your project. Then, when Visual Studio displays the Report Viewer Tasks panel, you select the Server Report from the Choose Report drop-down list. And this causes Visual Studio to change the look of that task pane in order to allow you to enter the report server URL and path to the report. And then there's also an option where you can design a new report, where you can create an entirely new local report. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. Next, you set the report server URL to point to the path of the reporting services server. And it needs to be in the format http://hostname/report server, or whatever you called the report server when you configured reporting services. Then you set the report path to the complete path to the report that you want to run, including the folder name and the leading slash. Don't include the report's extension. And then finally you save the form and open it up with Internet Explorer. And the report viewer should contain the rendered report. It's as easy as that. In this exercise, I'm going to create a new ASP.NET Web Forms page and use the Web Report Viewer control, add it to a page, and hook it up to display the sales chart sample report. All right, so there's a number of steps that we need to do. Here I am in a brand new started instance of Microsoft Visual Studio. I don't have any projects loaded, so I'm starting from scratch. So I'll come here, do File, New Project. And I'm going to create this in Visual C#. Of course, anything that I'm doing here you can do in Visual Basic as well. I'll select Web, and this is the Universal ASP.NET Web application. I'll put it in my Sample Files folder. You can put it anywhere that's convenient. And I'm going to name the project Report Server Viewer. Okay? Whatever name makes sense. All right, then Visual Studio opens up this new ASP.NET project and lets me select how I want to create this project. If you're not familiar with this, there's a number of different project types you can use. Empty creates a pretty minimal empty project. Web Forms creates a Web Forms application. MVC creates an MVC application. You can create a Web API, a single page application, and an Azure mobile service. As you can see, there's plenty of room for Microsoft to add other project types over time. But in this case, I'm going to use the empty project template. This is going to create a project with minimal cruft contained in most of the other project types. I could create a Web Forms, but that adds a lot of pages, authentication and authorization stuff, just a lot of things that I don't need in the simple sample application. So I'm just going to go with empty in this case. But I do need it to add the web forms infrastructure. So I'll select that right down there. I could also add MVC and Web API. I can mix and match projects and so forth. And if I wanted to, I could add unit tests and so forth. Some project types require selecting authentication or no authentication, although that's not usually the default. And I don't want to host it in the cloud, so I'll uncheck that. Okay, so I'll go ahead and click there, and it'll create the project. Now I need to add a web form to the project. So I'll right-click on the project name, select Add, and notice that it's one of the types that is listed here. If it isn't, then I could select New Item and go to the dialog box that has all of the available items in the context that I'm in. Okay, I'll add web form, and I want to name this Sales Chart Report. Now in this case, I'm naming the particular report that it's going to display. That certainly isn't necessary. There's nothing magical about this name. But I could also create a web form that allowed the user to select different reports. So I'd probably use a different name. Click on OK, and it creates the file and opens it up within the designer. I'm going to be working in design view, so I'll switch over to that view. And now I have a nice GUI design surface to work with. All right, this is going to be a very simple report page, but I need to add two different controls. So I'll go over here to the toolbox. It takes a second for it to be populated. I don't need any of the standard controls, but I need to add an AJAX extension, and specifically the script manager. Now this doesn't have a user interface or a visual interface at runtime, but it is something that the report viewer control needs. I also don't need to rename it, I don't need to configure it, I don't have to write any code for it or anything. It just needs to be there on the page. All right, then the second thing I need is the report viewer itself. And I'll find that under reporting. And there's the report viewer, double click. And I've added that to the page. And as you can see, it automatically opens this report viewer tasks pane. All right, so the first thing I need to do is select an option here and choose report. And as you can see, the only option I have is server report. The reason it's the only option is because I don't have any local reports defined within this project. If I did, those would be listed here and I could display them. But in this example, we're using server reports, so I just need to indicate that it's going to be a report on a reporting services server someplace. And then as you can see, it expands the tasks pane in order to show me a couple different options. First thing I need to set is a report server URL, and it goes ahead and populates it with the default of localhost report server. Now this works perfectly for me because I'm running against a local instance of reporting services, and it's called report server, so I don't need to make a change. But if I'm using this on some remote server, or I've named my reporting services instance something else for web service access, then I would need to change that. All right, then the other thing I need to do is specify the report path. Now, despite the name, this is both the path to the report on the report server as well as the name of the report. So I need to add the path, sample reports, / sales chart. Okay. All right, so that configures the report in terms of what report is going to be displayed and its location, what server it's coming from. All right, next thing I need to do is expand the size of this a bit. It's currently at about 400 pixels. I want to make it around 700 or so. Kind of hard to do exactly, but I could also set the properties of the control as well if I wanted it exactly 700 pixels. Now, if I fail to do that, I would have to scroll the report from side to side in order to see the full contents. So not a big deal, but I can always come back in and scale it to the proper size of the report. Okay, I'll save my changes. And I'll go ahead and run it. I'll go and build the project, compile all the code, and then display that page using a custom IP address because I'm currently using IIS Express on this development machine. And sample reports sales chart can be found. All right, so I did something wrong here. Let's see if I can figure out what the problem is. Samples reports. I misspelled that. All right. Unfortunately, all mistakes that I make are not always that easy to find. Okay, so sample reports, save the changes again, and rerun it. Cross my fingers. Looking good. And there we have the report. All right, as you can see, I have a nice little toolbar that's reminiscent of the Report Manager toolbar. It's not quite the same. I don't have the feed export button there. And there's a couple other little subtle changes, but for the most part it has the same functionality. I can navigate around, I can select, I can zoom in and out, I can make it really small, I can make it humongous, and in fact in this case I have to scroll to see any of it because it's so big and I can't even see it for some reason. Anyway, that's a little bit unrealistic anyway, so let's go back to it down to 100%. If I had text in it, I could search for text, and I can export files, refresh it, and print it. Now I want to emphasize how this is working. Notice the URL that I have here, localhost, IP address 1543, and then sales chart report. So I'm going against a web host, happens to be on this local machine, but it's a web host, that is displaying this page, that is sending down the HTML for this page. But then on that web server, it is then making a call into that reporting services instance in order to get this report so that the report viewer can render it on the page. So it's a fairly complex interaction that's going on in order to display this page to the user. Okay, so I'm going to close this page, come back in here, and I have the report viewer selected. And I'll come over here to the properties window. As you can see, there are a very large number of properties that you can use in order to customize both the appearance and the behavior of the report viewer control. Some of the most useful are here in the toolbar section. So all of these are set to true, so all of these toolbar elements are displayed. But I can turn that off. I can turn them on and off dynamically if I want to, because they're just properties of this control, and there's nothing special about this. It's just like any other web forms control that I can add on my page, server-side control. And another group of properties that you're likely to want to use is the server report, because this has the report server URL, that's the actual name of the property, to identify what report server we're going against, and then the report path. So that includes, these are the two values that I added to that task pane as part of the control. Then I can also have a display name, history ID, and various other items. So you have a lot of options for customizing how this control works in order to display the report to the user.